So my name's Jason Appel. I've been working at BKL for 24 years, looking after a client portfolio, looking after the real estate team, and heading up the non-audit compliance team, which sounds very interesting. Property represents about 20% of our business. We provide expert advice to companies and individuals. We have the pleasure of being able to call on property taxation experts within BKL, Andrew Levine, and on direct taxation, and Simon Levine on VAT, which adds significant strength to our offering. Simon will be talking to you a bit later on the VAT considerations for commercial property. Property is not our only expertise, and we also specialise in financial services, media, entertainment, academies. We're not restricted to companies. We deal with sole traders all the way up to large audits from all sectors. We will be in MIPIM in March, so if anyone is going to be there and would like to hang out and do some proper networking as you do in MIPIM, that's get in touch. It's always an enjoyable time. At BKL, we're growing very rapidly at the moment. Our latest acquisition is a business called CF Pro, which adds a very exciting addition to BKL's toolkit. They provide specialist support to fast-growing businesses, enabling them to reach their goals, and adding another very, very strong string to the BKL armour or bow. These are very exciting times for us. ESG has become a key factor for all businesses, and the requirements for understanding and dealing with ESG are becoming more prescriptive. At BKL, we've been working on our own ESG impact for a long time now. We're a B Corp, which has provided a platform for us to be able to advise and give our experience to other businesses in the area. So this afternoon, you'll hear from Muv, our head of ESG at BKL, and talk about the trends that we're seeing in the property market and the impact on the industry. We are also very excited to welcome Alistair Kent from Trevant Capital and Abby Chowdhury from Veritas Advisory. Alistair is going to give us an insight into the commercial property market with some examples of what he and his clients have been up to. And Abby is going to talk to us about capital allowances and the numerous opportunities there are to take advantage of this tax benefit. I'll leave it for them to introduce themselves and give themselves a positive history of what they can advise and provide. I don't want to do them sell them short of anything. So we look forward to hearing from those guys. But first of all, we're going to turn to Muv, who's going to give us an insight into the. Oh, I forgot to move on to the agenda. Give us an insight into planning and sustainability. Muv, would you like to? Well, we will have some questions at the end, and if you save them up, or if you have questions as we're going along, please put them in the chat, and we'll see when we can pick them up. And if we don't have time, we will certainly pick them up after the webinar. So I'll see you at the end. Muv?
Awesome. Thanks, Jason. So I'm here today to talk a bit about ESG, sustainability in the property sector. What does it mean? Alphabet soup, all the different terms and terminology and why it matters. I'm going to keep it pretty high level, but if you guys have any questions or thoughts afterwards, please feel free to ask me, ask Jason, ask the team, or follow up later as well. We've got a lot more knowledge than this behind us. So I thought I'd start with the most important question of all. What is ESG? Is it the new CSR? Is it corporate philanthropy? What is it? I guess it's been hailed as the new CSR in some ways, but what it really is a monetary measure of how risky your business, your property, your organisation is to investors in tomorrow's world. So how aware are you as a management team of what's coming around the corner, and how well are you planning for it? And that's looking at environmental, it's looking at social, it's also looking at governance, which is how well the business is run and how you make good decisions in the business place. So the bankers are looking at this stuff, the insurers are looking at this stuff. Is it safe to insure your property, your investment, your business in tomorrow's world? Is it safe to invest and to lend to your business in tomorrow's world? So this is why this is what ESG is, and what it's, the considerations that are going through the books at the moment. If I flick on to the next slide, I put a quick slide together on why it matters, why is it on the agenda. So this is around climate change. In this particular example, it's about more than climate change, of course, but the climate is changing. The world that we are building our properties in is changing, and the considerations that we have to bear in mind have to change too. And there are some quite significant changes that are going on. I mean, this is just from September 23. There are similar graphs from January 24, for example, talking about climate change. And the reason it matters, hang on, I need to work out how to move these slides on. I should have practiced better. So this is a slide from the Institute of Chartered Accountants, where they put together predictions of what each degree of global warming does to us as a business sector, as a business community, really. What the government's aims, what the world's aims are, were to keep us to 1.5 degrees increase above pre-industrial levels, which keeps us in the green zone, if you see on the little chart that I've got here. And you can see that 1.5 degrees would have needed us to reduce global emissions by 42% by 2030. There was a report that was sent out and around earlier this year, actually, which said that for the first time in 2023, the global temperature did exceed 1.5 degrees on average, but hasn't settled there yet. So we can see that while 1.5 degrees would have been nice, what we really need to plan for as business owners, property owners, is, what are we going to do at 3 degrees? Hopefully not, but what are we going to do at 5 degrees? And we can see global GDP impact, implications there. We can see some implications at 3 degrees of physical stranding of assets too, which is probably quite useful to explain the concept of stranded assets. It's quite important in terms of property, actually. It's quite easy to visualize in terms of property. So the idea here is if we have a building that has no net zero plan, that is poorly energy efficient, that isn't suitable for tomorrow's world, then in tomorrow's world, nobody wants to insure that asset. As I mentioned before, nobody wants to invest in that asset or lend against that asset. Nobody wants to inhabit that asset because the tenants need to prepare their own net zero plans. So your building might not be appropriate for them. So if nobody wants to lend against it, you can't insure it, nobody wants to occupy it, then the valuation will reduce and you end up with what's called a stranded asset in your portfolio, something that you can't sell, something that is too expensive to retrofit now because you can't get funding against it, and something that nobody actually wants to use. So that's the concept of stranding of assets in portfolios. So this gives us a bit of a concept of, why this stuff matters, why we need to start looking at things differently. And we can also see what the government's been doing in the background. So in the background, this was a graph that I found. I love a bit of a dig around in the gov.uk website that shows us what the government's been doing to reduce CO2 emissions in the background over the past 40 years or so. So we can see that the energy emissions, so that's the infrastructure, the power infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure, has been changed behind the scenes to rely more on renewables than on fossil fuels over the past 20, 30, 40 years. And you can see a significant drop there. We can see the electrification of transport as well has created a large drop in the last few years. So it's not a leap to recognise that whatever it is the government is actually saying, that on the trajectory, on the plans, we can see that business and resi have to come next. And if you think business also includes commercial property too. So that's the direction of travel here. And it's clear that the government will have to do something. And what we're finding they're doing is not talking about it, but targeting large companies instead and requiring large companies to audit their own supply chain. So where you've got large commercial property owners, for example, they have already had to go through their entire base of properties and assess which ones can and which ones can't have a net zero plan. And they've got time now to divest those if they want to, so sell them off in the market while the valuations are still high. And they're also now having to look at who they're supplying to, who their suppliers are, and what their policies are around net zero also. So what we're seeing is a lot of pressure on the large companies, on large infrastructures to make changes that force the smaller organizations to do things differently. It's a bit sneaky, actually. If we go to horizon scanning for sustainable business risks and opportunities, this is where I've tried to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, looking at what are we seeing already, what do we think will come in the next 5 years, and what looks more likely maybe in the next 8 to 10 years or so. And I think in the immediate term, we've probably all seen the shift, the fashion, the requirement to build buildings that people want to occupy. So healthy spaces, lots of air, good circulation of heat, of light, of energy, of sound, somewhere where it feels really social to operate in. I can see that the building, that this tiny room I'm in right now doesn't look very social, but the rest of the building actually is. So it's quite nice out there. We can see more regulation coming in on EPC ratings, biodiversity net gain, nutrient neutrals, causing a lot of drama at planning, actually really slowing down the planning process, which is giving it a lot of bad press, but mostly because the process hasn't been fully thought through. So that's giving a lot of this stuff a bit of a bad name, but we're seeing it getting in the way at the moment. While we're seeing regulation starting to increase, what we're not seeing at the moment in the UK is any specific regulation stopping us from emitting carbon. Organisations need net zero plans. The large organisations need net zero plans, and growing organisations and mid-tier organisations are encouraged to think about them. But there's nothing stopping you at the moment if you wanted to knock a building down, which, again, I don't know if it's common knowledge, but knocking a building down emits a lot more carbon and wastes a lot more carbon than it does to just retrofit it, for example. So we can see that while in the future there might be regulations that stop you from emitting large carbon outputs from knocking a building down, at the moment there isn't that. So there is, a little bit of leeway here to do some stuff now rather than do it later. If that's what we wanted to do, because there is the freedom to do that at the moment. And we can also see that larger institutional investors are already making choices to divest of low net zero opportunity buildings. And what we're also seeing is that clients like, of our sorts of size, businesses like our sorts of size, are buying those up because there's nothing to stop them at the moment. There's nothing to tell them this is a problem. Valuation doesn't build in at present anything to do with EPC or net zero or any of those sorts of things for now. So we're seeing these buildings being sold into the market. Indeed, a few of my clients who I spoke to relatively recently, since I mentioned this to them about a year ago, they said, gosh, we have noticed that all the buildings that we're seeing on the market at the minute are typically, really poor EPC type properties that we would have looked at, but we're looking at differently now. We're also seeing clients with commercial buildings being asked by their tenants a lot more for their carbon emissions. So that's also a factor there. Are you able to, if your tenants ask you for carbon emissions associated with their rental, are you able to provide them that information? So there's a question there that we're also seeing coming up a lot more now, in particular with serviced offices. Actually, that's coming up a lot more. Near term, so we are seeing already banks offering preferential lending for efficient buildings and businesses. I mean, it doesn't make or break an acquisition at the moment. There's the sorts of rates they're talking about, but it definitely is moving in that direction. And I ran a seminar with one of the big banks relatively recently, and they said to me off the record, although they weren't saying it to their clients at the moment, that while they aren't turning away non-net zero type properties, buildings, deals at the moment, that they are considering doing that in the future, or not considering, they could see that that's where it was going to have to go, but they didn't want to frighten their clients with it at the moment. But we do need to know, and we do need to think about it. We're looking at resource efficiency as well. So how do we operate the buildings that we're in? The maintenance cost of a building, I didn't realise this, costs 3 times more over the life of the building than the cost of building it. But if you want to retrofit it or change it later, it's a lot more expensive. So like the curve goes the other way, that it's much more difficult when the building is set and built to then change the plumbing or to change how change the heating system, for example. So we need to start thinking differently about buildings at planning stage, at development stage, rather than seeing it as a problem to sort out later. But we are going to find resource efficiency being a lot more of a key consideration. So, for example, water is something that we use quite freely now, but in the future, I mean, I read a statistic that London is one of the cities that is closest to running out of water in the general ecosystem of large growing cities of the world. And of course, it's not going to come to that, because we're going to work around it and find different ways to work around it. But what we will find is that if the water is scarce, it will become more expensive. And at the moment, all our buildings are set up to use drinking water to flush toilets, for example. So there are different ways we could set ourselves up to maximize resource efficiency in the buildings that we have. There's a concept in sustainability around moving from linear processes to more circular processes. So, for example, we're seeing this a lot more in the construction sector now, having to think about how to reuse stuff that comes out of demolition so that less goes to landfill. That's going to become much more prevalent in the immediate term, with penal implications if we don't. We're also seeing, and I should have moved this into immediate term, but we're seeing cross-border carbon pricing mechanisms coming in place as well. So the CBAM is something that's come in place in particular for build materials, steel, cement, that kind of stuff, which will govern import and export prices of these materials in and out of the EU and in and out of the UK. So that's going to start changing thought processes around what we import and export to. And also, I mentioned before, value chain reporting. So the large organizations already have to report on what their supply chain is doing, their value chain is doing. And we're seeing large organizations make decisions to divest or move away from suppliers that don't have these sorts of plans or thoughts or considerations in place. There's also all this sort of stuff going on in the interim. Longer term, like I mentioned before, if we are building buildings that need to withstand more extreme weather, more rain, more wind, more heat, then we need to think about how we're building our buildings to withstand that stuff. And so I think building regulations will have to change to make sure that buildings remain safe and can continue to work effectively for us. I've talked before about insurance and lending principles changing. HSBC already mentioned that was something that they might be considering in the future. Net zero economy will change the norms with carbon pricing and restrictions. When I think about this, it feels a little bit like how you used to be able to go into a restaurant, say 10 years ago, and somebody could light up a cigarette on the table next to you, or somebody would light a cigarette in a bar. And now it's a bit like, oh my goodness, that's so disgusting. Why are you doing that? And the social norms change quite a lot when regulation moves. And I mentioned already about the regulation around demolition of buildings, likely to come in at some point in the future when more strict carbon regimes come in. And also looking at changes in the valuation principle. So at the moment, we're talking about green premiums, but it's more likely in the future to shift more towards they call it a brown discount, which is not the nicest way of putting it, but the idea that it's not about a premium for a green, sustainable building, but it's more around, well, what do I have to discount this by because it's not? That's one of the things that we need to bear in mind. In terms of, try not to frighten anybody here, in terms of where we are, what can we do? So I've got a bit of a slide here on start where you are. There are lots of organizations in a similar position. It's a very difficult, it's expensive. I know there's not a dearth of solutions in the market either. So we're all finding our way. But I think it's about really looking, taking the blinkers off and looking at your portfolio, understanding what your portfolio looks like, what's the potential for stranded assets in your own portfolios, and making sure that you take some good advice. There is lots of poor advice out there on retrofits, but get some good advice on retrofits, heating, ventilation, electrification of heating systems. As you've probably picked up already, think differently about what you're buying. Look at what you're buying at the minute. What are you really buying in tomorrow's world? And aim for the highest efficiency standards. It might be that, you know, the low bar is 1 EPC rating. I would suggest go for the max. The difficulty with the EPC system at the moment is that it's very much a system that can be manipulated, is what I see in practice. Maybe manipulate is a stronger word. If you go to one EPC ratings person, they'll give you one grade, and if you go to another and say, but have you seen this, they'll give you a slightly different grade. It's not a robust process at the moment, but go for the best standards you can. Looking at your sources of electricity as well, electrification, on-site stuff, you know, solar panels aren't as expensive now as they used to be. And also talk to your lenders and see what alternative financing options there are available for you at the moment. And that's my suggestions. Very well happy to take questions at the end. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Marv. There's so much to fit in there, so much to fit in there that it's quite difficult. So again, if anyone's got any questions, please feel free to either enter in the chat, get in contact with Marv to find out a little bit more about these requirements. Alistair.
Hi. So I'm just going to give you a little bit background about me. It's probably the easiest way to do it. So Trovent, what are we? We're a wealth preservation commercial property specialist. That really mean we specialise in long lease investments in the weatherproof sectors, essential retail, and we try and deliver our clients secure asset-backed income and growth. We're born out of a fund originally, so we have access to an exclusive network of developers and asset managers who've been involved. I personally have been involved in about 700 million of commercial property transactions, and yeah, been doing it a while. There we go. We'll skip this one, but this is just really why we like commercial property. The big ones being good long leases, good dependable income, good strong tenants. And I can go on, but this is just a bit on our numbers, but it'll give you a feel of kind of what we do. So since 2019, we've been involved in just under 115 transactions, 100 million pounds worth of funds invested for clients. Lot sizes range really from the smallest takeaways and little shops with flats above, all the way up to much larger and more substantial. But we stay below the fund, so we're not interested in sort of the large superstore type assets. And you can see our lot size is just under 1 million. These are our key sectors that we're involved in at the moment. So local supermarkets and convenience stores, drive-through and roadside assets, education, which I'm going to come on to in a moment a bit more, and convenience food, which I mentioned. So the market, where's the market? I think I've been asked what are the trends, where are we? And I've left here interest rates, because I did this for a presentation not that long ago. We had one on inflation. I had one on COVID. And insert next problem here. I mean, the fact is there are always noises and things going on in the outside world that will affect the market in some way or another. Those have challenges. Those challenges present opportunities. So when you have uncertainty, you can be opportunistic. You can look at how people are doing things. Are they shopping differently? The takeaway, the Deliveroo, the Just Eat model is really good for the takeaway and really relaunched sort of the food side. When you've got tenants that are struggling with rent, what can you do? Well, you can identify strong sectors, stronger tenants in stronger sectors. And I know that you're getting some decent returns on money in the bank at the moment, but long-term savings do not outperform the properties that we get involved in. And just to illustrate my point, this is a slide from 2022. And basically, the pink line are property yields. For those that can't see it sort of up close and personal, the pink lines are property yields from 1980 to date. We've got the base rate, which is a dark blue line, and we've got inflation, which is the grey line. And what you can basically see is there is a lot of fluctuation outside of real estate, but the real estate yields, yeah, they have up peaks and troughs like everything else, but it's not quite so wild. And this is a cross section on the market. So what did our clients buy last year? What did our clients get involved in? Our clients bought almost £33 million worth of assets last year. It was 17 different transactions in convenience, education, takeaway, and some high street. Most of the lots, the average lot size was 1.9 million. That was up from 1.2 in 2022. And you can see that the sort of yield profile that we're looking at when you're talking about long income, just under 6%. So you're buying very, very long lease assets with very good tenants in place. And as an example, 77% of our transactions last year were carried out by cash buyers. Just so you know, it's not just us. This is Allsops. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Allsops. They on the auction side, they have the largest commercial auctions market in the, well, as far as I'm aware, certainly the most regular. And you can see these are on their website, but you can see that the drop off 2022 they did 558 million. In 2023 it was down to 442. But in terms of the number of lots sold, not a huge difference, 50 60 lots. But as we got to Q4 of last year, you can see that things came back to where they were. So less lots were sold, but in terms of lot sizes and funds raised and success rates, it's as broad as it is long. And actually, there was obviously a little fluctuation, but the market seems to be holding quite firm. And the things certainly that are relevant to us are what in terms of what was selling well, long income investments and affluent locations. We did a lot in the southeast last year. So what are people buying on the tenant side? I talked about your responsibilities as a landlord. So you'll see that what we've looked at here is we look at consumer staples, we look at essential retail, we look at education, we look at medical, tangible goods and services, things that cannot be threatened so much by online. We look at quality tenants, so quality operators with multiple locations, not just people that have single assets. There's an ethical and social responsibility side of things. There's also ESG coming in, and those tenants more and more are becoming B Corps like BKLR and others, really looking at what they do, not just like as an investor in people, but a wider world and at social awareness. These sites are future-proof, so almost everything that we do now has EV charging. If it's a convenience store, it's got EV charging. If it's a drive-through, it's got EV charging. People are thinking about the EPC ratings. I'll come on to a nursery in a minute, but we're the sectors we're looking at, we're achieving, or the tenants are achieving EPC ratings. We are working on the kind of tenants that take responsibility for future legislation that they don't know about yet, and we wrap that into the leases to make sure if they're on an FRI lease, they can't say, well, there's new guidelines we didn't know about, we're not having that. The Tesco's and Sainsbury's and others of this world, the ones that have the broader shoulders, if you're a landlord, they're a great one to have, because as I've said, it's it's coming for all of us, and those are the ones that actually have the financial might to take that on board and really push it across. And the last for me is the huggability factor. People are buying assets more and more close to home, something they can see, something that's within an hour or so of where they live. Just a couple of snapshots just to show you kind of where the market moved for us last year. Brand new convenience store, it's an old Mazda showroom. Client bought it, spent £800,000 on fit out and construction work for Tesco's. This was bought by a local guy. You're going to see it achieved a very, very good price for them at 4.5% in April last year, given what was going on in the world. This was an asset we acquired for clients, a brand new children's day nursery, let on very long lease, a 25-year lease. Big asset, lots of money pushed into the redevelopment and fit out of these buildings. Again, very good yield. This is in Gloucester Road in South Ken, showing where you can achieve a slightly better yield, but still a good area. This was another nursery, an established one, was acquired by one of our property fund clients. They bought it with some debt from Coutts along the way. That was in the middle of last year. This is a private investor bought this. This has been a village shop for 100 years. The guy wanted to move on. Co-op came in and took it over. And it's a local post office as well. And it's just a good, solid asset that's supplying the town. It's going to supply the town for many, many years to come. And by having a strong tenant in there like Co-op, taking on the responsibility of that building, hopefully you're future-proofing your responsibilities for it. And then just another nursery that we did down in Godalming, and another one that we did up in Altrincham. But you can see that sort of yield sustained for us over the course of last year. What do clients want? I've already said these things already. What do they really want? Stability. It's what we're all looking for at the moment, certainly in the markets, property or otherwise. It'd be a lot of fun with an election year coming up. And so I want to focus on the education sector as one that's really offering a lot of stability for our clients. We've done a lot of it over last year. There's a huge amount of government support for it from April. For those that don't know, but from April this year, 2-year-olds get 15 hours of free childcare. For September, it will be 15 hours of free childcare for 9 months and above. For 2025, that's going up to 30 hours of free childcare. And you've got government incentives like the Do Something Big incentive, where there's huge recruitment drive into nurseries and educational carers. They're offering cash into that £1,000 signing on bonuses, those types of things. Why do we love it? Why do I think it's certainly a trend we've seen in the market? You get very long leases, 20-25 years. The income is typically 5.75 to 6%. Going back 18 months, there was probably 3/4 of a point, half a point down from that. So it's come off, but it hasn't come off horrendously like other parts of the market. You've got capital growth because you've got index-linked rent reviews, typically capped and collared, but you're looking at anything up to 4% every 5 years, annualized. The tenants spend a lot of money on these, so they're building schools effectively. So they're spending 25% to 100% of the value of your asset on fit out led property, and their investments are very high. We're getting EPC ratings of A's on most of them at the moment, A23 on the latest one that we're marketing. These companies got strong ESG credentials. End Family Club is probably one of the most well-known in London at the moment. They're a B Corp. They're investors in people. They're charities. They have a social conscience, which is becoming more and more relevant to landlords. There's a government support for this, as I've mentioned, and there's independent oversight. I know Ofsted's got a bad name, but it's Ofsted or Health and Safety Executive. Buildings that work in this sector have a lot more red tape around them, and that is a good thing as far as making sure your tenants are doing the right thing by you as a landlord. And they offer security, predictability, and capital preservation. This is 2022. Christian Co, probably the biggest in the education space, the day nursery space. This is their outlook for the market. Some quotes there, which I'll share, but their outlook was it was going to remain buoyant. The regional operators would consolidate. There'd be high-profile portfolios. The appetite would grow, and there'd be more independents coming into the market. And this is what happened for us. So in 2022, we did 7 of these. In 23, we did 10. Our clients invested 13 million into this in 22, and it was up by 10 million. And the lot size increased because well, it was London and South East, and the market sharpened for us. So what do I see? What's my crystal ball tell me for 2024? I don't know. We're going to focus on more of these types of opportunities, off-market, quiet opportunities in defensive sectors with high-quality tenants and recognised brands, trying to provide low volatility and stability for our clients. And this is an example. We're launching this next week. It's a brand new day nursery in Reading. It's opposite Royal Berkshire Hospital. It's a huge site with lots of different opportunities in the long term. But in the meantime, it's going to offer you 25 years worth of unbroken income with index-linked reviews. They spent £1.5 million on the fit out of the building. It's already got an EPC rating of A23, and that future responsibility to keep that level up and keep the building maintained, that is with the tenant. So that's where we see it. These are a few other things. That's what I think where the market's going to be at the moment.
Thanks, Alistair. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. That's a really, really interesting insight. And I think everybody can. Everyone's interested in people that see a lot more of the market than some people who are working in their own little space. So that's really great. Thank you very much. Abu, talk to us about some opportunities in capital allowances, which is it's something that does get forgotten about sometimes, and it's really important to consider this in any transaction. And sometimes it gets left to the last minute when we see transactions, so it's worth thinking about early. There are some tax, really good tax incentives, and I'll leave Abu to fill you in.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Jason. So yeah, my name's Abu Chowdhury. We work for Veritas Advisory. We purely specialise in claiming capital allowances, tax relief on property expenditure. So capital allowances is the only way of writing off property expenditure in the UK against your corporation, corporate income or personal income from rental profits or trading profits. So I have been specialising in capital allowances for the last 11 years. As a firm, we've been around for the last 10 years. We've had more than 100 years of experience in this speciality. Speciality derives from understanding construction and tax. So we're both surveyors and tax qualified. And that allows us to maximise the full potential of any tax relief on a given property. So in the next 10 minutes, I'll be looking to give you an overview of what capital allowances are and how it works, opportunities to look out for, and some practical action points when you're acquiring or developing a commercial property. And lastly, I will end with the potential risk of not doing things right. So what are capital allowances? Capital allowances is the only way of writing off property expenditure in the UK. It's a government incentive. It's very to encourage investment in capital assets. It's been around for 100 years. It's very vanilla. Routine tax planning is just in order to maximize the full potential of allowances, it requires you to go into the detail of the construction spend or the acquisition spend to derive that significant quantum of tax relief available. Claiming this tax relief does not affect your capital gains tax position on sale of the property. So something, if you claim capital allowances, you get the income tax relief as in while you're getting the rental income or the trading income. And when it comes to disposing of the asset, then you're hit with a larger tax bill through capital gain charge, and therefore the tax relief that you've got from income tax relief is clawed back. But this is not the case. In the UK, it's quite unique. You are able to retain the tax relief, income tax relief on sale of the property through a mechanism called S198 tax election. I'll talk about that in a later slide. So, what kind of things qualify for capital allowances within the property? I'll be purely talking about capital allowances on property expenditure. So typical things that would qualify on a property would be air conditioning, heating, lighting, fire alarm systems, carpet flooring, lifts, sprinkler systems, and so on. So these assets can qualify for the capital allowances tax relief. So if you're going through a construction or development of a project, you'll sieve out those items and try to capture the quantum related to those items, and you use that total quantum and reduce your profits going forward. So in terms of commercial capital allowances that we cover in terms of property covers commercial property and residential property. So examples of commercial property will be we'll look at hotels, offices, logistics warehouses, storage facilities, data centers, restaurants, retailers, private schools, and nurseries. And with regards to residential, we'll cover care homes, furnished holiday lets, student accommodation, build to rent residential blocks. With regards to student accommodation and build to rents, the caveat is you cannot claim capital allowances within the student rooms or the apartments within a residential block. This is a restriction legislated in the Capital Allowances Act. So here's in the first table, this is an illustration of how the capital allowances works. So in the first instance, you have a corporate investor who's invested in a property and have rental income of £2 million. They have deductible debt finance cost of £1 million and no capital allowances claim, and the profits liable to tax is £1 million. So a corporate tax rate of 25%, that equates to a £250,000 tax saving. Conversely, you have a scenario where you claim capital allowances. So again, you've got 2 million of income, you've got expenses of £1 million, and then this time you've got a capital allowances specialist involved, and you've identified the full available capital allowances available in the property, and you've been able to write off a further £1 million of profits, and as a result, your profit for that period is now zero. So you've gone from £250,000 of tax liability to a nil tax liability, and that's the value of capital allowances. So in the second table, this is just an illustration of the various subcategories of capital allowances. So different assets have a different rate of tax relief or recovery of the tax relief. So you can go from the structure and building allowances, which is at 3%. So you get to write off 3% of your expenditure in the first year, and you do that until you've recovered the entire cost. Then you've got the faster tax relief, which is the 150% land remediation relief. And that relates to if you're removing asbestos within the property, you spend £1 million on asbestos removal, you get to write off £1.5 million against your profits in the current year. So the charts is supposed to show you spend £1 million at 3% rate, you get 3% off. And with the 150% rate, you get much faster tax relief. And since COVID, the government introduced the full expense, 100% full expensing, and 50% special rate pool allowance. This wasn't around pre-COVID. This was to incentivize investment in capital assets, such as property or an item of plant. Or if you were to buy a computer, you get to write that off 100%. If you were to buy a new sprinkler system for your property, then you get to write that off at 100% as well. So that's what's at play at the moment, and that's just to illustrate how the capital allowances works and the various rates of tax relief available on the property. Then now I'll be talking about the claim opportunities when it comes to a commercial property. There are, you could say, 3 bites to a commercial or residential property. When you're acquiring a second-hand asset or a new build asset, there's potential to claim capital allowances embedded within the property, because what you're paying for is the land, the structure, and then all the equipment within the property. What I mean by equipment is your capital assets, such as your heating system, air conditioning system, carpet flooring, sanitary installation, and so on. So as a specialist, we will go in and, using the surveying skills, price up the land value, price up the structure value, and price up the capital allowances qualifying asset value. And then this qualifying asset value is what you will be claiming. And it's in line with the HMRC approved formula on how to derive or extract capital allowances from an acquisition of second-hand property. The process So the part of the process is looking at the tax history of the property, because in a property, the idea is that you claim one lot of capital allowances, so one lot of tax relief throughout the history of the property. The process has been made a lot more complex since 2014, where now if a buyer of a property was to benefit from any capital allowances being tax-paying, then they need to obtain cooperation from the seller. So the seller, if they're tax-paying, they need to recognize the available capital allowance within that property and then transfer those over to the new buyer at via a tax election. No cooperation from the seller would result in nil capital allowances being benefited from. But there are instances, if you're buying for a non-tax-paying, the best case scenario is when you're buying from a non-tax-paying seller, a tax-exempt pension fund, a charity, or a trading stock developer, someone who buys and aims to just sell immediately, therefore don't hold it as capital, therefore can't claim capital allowances. So those instances, you require minimal or no cooperation from the seller, apart from a statement to say, as a seller, I cannot claim capital allowances, therefore the buyer is entitled. So on acquisitions, we'll identify, we'll break down the purchase price between the land, the building, and the capital allowances, qualifying assets within the building, and that's what you will be claiming. From my experience, we find a lot of advisors saying, just assume there's no available capital allowances. Without looking at tax history, they'll see a tax election. A tax election is basically a mechanism only unique to the UK, where the seller and buyer agrees to, a seller is able to transfer over any available capital allowances to the new buyer. And it's just a vehicle to transfer capital allowances between a buyer and a seller. If the seller decides to retain the tax relief, then they will put a quantum in the tax election, which enables to retain everything over. This will be a £2 tax election. So if you've got £1 million of capital allowances claimed by a seller and they want to keep all of that, they will recognize a £2 tax election. So the new buyer only benefits from £2 and the seller benefits from 1 million less to £2. So this mechanism's been in place for many years and is a requirement since 2014 to be entered into. And you need to do this exercise within 2 years of the completion date. So yeah, so sometimes advisors will see there's no capital allowances clauses in the heads of terms or the sale and purchase contract, and therefore just assume there's no scope. But changes in legislation and sometimes the ownership history of the property would actually highlight there is actually opportunity to claim capital allowances on the property. So it's best to speak to a specialist and just have a quick overview and let them decide if there's scope or not. And early involvement does result in better result. And the second opportunity is you bought the property, now you're going to undertake your strip out and refurbishment works on the property. So or fit out or make contribution work. So here we'll look through the construction expenditure. So you instructed the main contractor to do the refurbishment. We'll go through the construction expenditure and see what's relievable for tax relief, your sanitary installation, your fire alarm, HVAC systems, and so on. And we look at both the main construction spend plus the associated professional fees, your project management fees, your design fees, your QSing fees, and so on. And in terms of our experience with advisors has been, yes, they may be able to identify the obvious items, but they're not fully identifying the full potential of allowances. Sometimes there's incidental work. So for instance, you'll have the contractor needing to replace the air conditioning. So they rip off the existing ceiling and then they put the air conditioning replacement in, and then they reinstate the old ceiling. Obviously, not the old ceiling, but they replace it. But this is as a result of having to put in the air conditioning system. So now you can attribute that cost of removing and reinstating the ceiling cost to the air conditioning. So now you've increased the quantum of capital allowances available. In addition to that, we find repairs are being missed out. So if you're replacing like-for-like windows, repainting existing surfaces, replastering existing walls, you're able to claim tax relief on that expenditure as well. And lastly, sometimes there might not be breakdowns of cost. Advisors may not claim tax relief because they're not aware of what this entails. So as a specialist, using our surveying skills, we're able to derive in terms of what works have been carried out and applying a model. And from this, we derive a cost. And this cost will be attributed to the air conditioning and so on, wherever works we see from a visit of the property. And lastly, with regards to opportunities, historical expenditure, we find many times where the claimant that the client who's incurring the expenditure hasn't claimed capital allowances while they were undertaking construction works, and they just assume actually it's old expenditure now, so I won't be able to claim. So I've done a historical exercise just recently where it's a chain of opticians. They haven't claimed capital allowances. They've claimed obvious items, but not the full potential. I went in, identified extra allowances on the construction expenditure, and we were able to identify extra 5 million of tax relief for the client. So even if it's old expenditure, it's worth still having to wave it around a specialist and go, look, is there any opportunities there? Then we'll seek to, we'll look into it. And there is no time limit. The only time limit is if the asset is no longer existing, then you can't claim capital allowance on that expenditure. So this concludes the 3 opportunities on capital allowances, capital allowance exercise. Just continuation in terms of.
Abby, sorry. I know we've got about 9 minutes now just to squeeze in a little bit of VAT.
Yeah.
We will forward on the slide from everyone here. So there has a question has come through, but let's just squeeze in a little bit of VAT on the before we finish, and then any more questions, and we'll send through the slides to everyone who's been taking part. So if you don't mind, I can hand over to Simon. Simon.
Yep. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. Let me just okay. So good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Simon Levine. I'm one of the 2 senior VAT consultants here at BKL, and my specialty is property and construction. So there was many things I could have actually spoken about, but I've decided to keep it nice and simple. And I want to talk to you about transfers of going concern, where you're selling a commercial property rental business. Now, on this first slide, which hopefully you can see, there are 3 conditions that when a seller is selling a property rental business, it can be a VAT-free transfer of a going concern. The first condition is that the buyer must be VAT registered or required to be registered for VAT at the time of the transfer, i.e. completion. Now, what's interesting, and a lot of people miss out, is if the annual rent roll of the property you're transferring, the business you're transferring, is under £85,000 a year, the buyer has to physically have his VAT number on the day of completion. It's no good getting it later and it being backdated. They have to physically have the VAT number on the day of completion, or the TOGC fails. If the annual rent roll is over £85,000 a year, then it's good enough just to have all the forms submitted to HMRC with effective date of being completion. Now, unless Alistair corrects me on this, that's sort of roughly working on about £1 million of cost to be 85,000 turnover. It's roughly about 1 million in and around. So if you're going to buy a building under 1 million, the chances are you may not have enough turnover that you need your VAT number on there. The second condition is that the buyer must have opted to tax the property by the correct date. Now, normally with deposits being held as stakeholder, that means by completion. If the deposit is not held as stakeholder, as I will mention on the next slide, that brings forward, in fact, this and the previous comment on registration to exchange of contracts. And then the last condition is that the buyer must make what's called the 5-2B declaration. Now, to keep things nice and simple, this is normally a standard clause in the TOGC VAT clauses, and it's very much an anti-avoidance measure. However, one of the strange things is if you look at HMRC's public notice on TOGCs, they will insist all 3 of those conditions must be met. But we are aware in the VAT profession that there has been some cases where a buyer hasn't done the 3rd condition, and HMRC have taken a view, well, in fact, you could have done it. Okay, you didn't do it, but we'll waive it and we'll let you off. It's not always advantageous for that to happen, but we are seeing that. Now, having dealt with a lot of and on a regular basis various sales of commercial property as going concerns, there's various pitfalls and problems I see on a relatively regular basis, which a lot of people tend to miss out on. So the first one is, what effect does the deposit held as agent and not a stakeholder cause? Obviously, once you exchange contracts, it's normal that you'll pay across 5% of the deposit to the seller. Now, if it's held as stakeholder, which basically means it's held in an escrow account until completion, that means all the dates you have to do things are by completion. But if it's held as agent, effectively it's released straight away. So as I said on the previous slide, various obligations and dates that you have are by exchange of contracts. And if you miss them, you've blown the TOGC for the whole deal. Now, the next point is the buyer a nominee for a separate beneficial buyer? The reason being, and this is what I see quite a lot, if you have a buyer who's basically buying it as nominee or on trust for somebody else, under the VAT law, it's the beneficial owner that needs to VAT register and opt to tax, not the nominee. I've seen it many, many times, unfortunately, where the buying parties VAT registered the wrong party. In addition, there's an extra form called the 1096 Statement of Practice that needs to be signed as well. If any of those get messed up, unfortunately, you're going to ruin the TOGC. Is the buyer flipping the property back to back? So if you are selling your property rental business to party B, and he's immediately onward selling it to party C, even though individually both could be a transfer of a going concern, even if you meet all the conditions, both fail under the VAT law. The next one is the building vacant, but the buyer wants you to put a tenant in before completion so the sale can be a transfer of a going concern. This is what we used to refer to as artificial TOGCs, where you used to basically stick the tenant in there to transfer it with it, and lo and behold, you've met the conditions. This hasn't worked in the main for a number of years since a case brought against the Royal College of Paediatricians and artificial TOGCs. It's potentially still applicable, but it's very, very difficult. So if you're selling a vacant building and a buyer says, listen, do us a favor, we got a tenant, will you sign him up? And then we can get the deal through as the TOGC. Your alarm bells need to go off and you need to come and speak to me. As I says, it might be okay, but it's very, very difficult and certain conditions must be met. And then the last one, which I actually dealt with too in the last few weeks, is the tenant an exempt business but wants an associated company of theirs to buy the property subject to their lease? And both cases, by the way, actually one was a doctor, one was a dentist. And effectively what happened was the doctor and dentist had a lease in this building and they wanted to buy the building. So what they did is they said to the seller, look, we've set up a separate SPV. What we want to do is we want the SPV to buy in the property subject to our lease as a transfer of a going concern. Now, if you remember correctly, if you remember from the previous slide, I happened to mention that one of the conditions for buying is the buyer must opt to tax the property. Now, because of some very complex anti-avoidance rules, because the dentist and the doctor in the two examples I had own the SPV that's going to buy the property, there's very complex options to tax anti-avoidance rules kick in. So the SPV's option to tax is invalid and will not apply. Hence no TOGC. So just be careful. Again, I've been brought in on a few nightmare cases after HMRC picked this all up, and there's not so much you can do. And I have to say that one of the reasons it's quite complicated is when HMRC brought these rules in, it was a proverbial sledgehammer to crack a nut. So they're catching a lot of situations that was not intended. So as I said, you need to just bear that in mind. And then lastly, about are you selling a VAT opted to tax building that's vacant, but you know the buyer is going to or looking to develop it for residential, maybe using permitted development to convert to Class C3 dwellings. What they'll look to do, the buyer, is they'll look to say to you, okay, Mr. Seller, we're buying this vacant building. We'd like to cancel your option to tax, and we'd like to serve you with a form 1614D, which effectively confirms that the buyer wants to convert to residential. Now, if the buyer serves the form on the seller before exchange of contracts, effectively what the technical law is, before the price is fixed. So that could actually mean heads of terms as well. If it's served before the price is fixed, the seller has to accept. If it's served after price is fixed but before completion, the seller can refuse. Effectively, it's to avoid buyers ambushing a seller, because everybody knows once we've exchanged contracts, the seller can't pull out. So obviously HMRC have recognized this and said, if the buyer serves it after exchange or HOTS and before completion, the seller can refuse. And one last thing, and I'm sorry I'm having to rush, but obviously I only had 9 minutes, is that if a buyer comes to you and says, listen, Mr. Seller, I want to get this building and convert it to residential, you need to ask him, are you looking to convert the building or demolish and rebuild? Because the certificate only applies where you're going to convert the building. If you're doing a demo, and if the buyer is intending to do a demo and rebuild, you cannot serve the certificate, and effectively the option to tax applies, and you have to charge VAT. The only example where you a buyer can do something is if they're housing association. And sorry, Jason, I think I went 1 minute over, so I hadn't had 10 minutes, but just nice and quick.
Thank you very, very much, everyone. I think, really interesting hour. So when we're looking at using Alistair to try and find us the next commercial property, we need to consider, the ESG, future profitability based on the issues that may bring. Also thinking about your transaction, the VAT implications, and then obviously capital allowances if they haven't been dealt with properly in the past. Or we think there's an opportunity, there will always be an opportunity and should always be checked. Certainly check the capital allowances out with Abu. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've all found it informative, and we will send the slides around, and please do get in contact. We haven't had time to answer the questions that have been posted. We'll contact you afterwards, and we'll send the slide around. And of course, any other questions, please feel free to get in touch, and have a lovely Tuesday. We'll see you at the next, if not in MIPIM, we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.
All right.